Well, staying with our schedule of going through the textbook still, the Science of Mind textbook written by Ernest Holmes, we are talking last week, this week, and next week about the creative process, the symbol, as David talked about a couple weeks ago. Last week we talked about spirit, and I shared that for me, spirit, or the one life being all that is something that for me cannot be separated from our talk today, which is soul, mind, law. They are entwined, they are one body, and they are something to understand in order to create the life that we desire. And so, let us move forward learning more about soul, mind, law.
Well, it's kind of confusing sometimes when we get into this part where we talk about the soul. The soul is that middle section in between. We pretty much understand what spirit is. We understand what God is, or at least we have a concept of that. We pretty much understand what we are as the body, and we experience things in physical form all the time, so we don't have to be reminded of what that is. But what is that mysterious part in between, which is the soul, that place which is called the creative medium, that part which is subjective law? Well, sometimes we have difficulty in terms of understanding that Holy Ghost part of our spiritual nature, and how does it fit, and how do we recognize it in our lives, and how do we use it? And so there's kind of a challenge in that. And so I think we look at that part of God a little differently than most spiritual traditions do, because we don't necessarily see it as God the big father figure, God the right word? No. Anthropomorphic, thank you. Anthropomorphic idea of God the Father as a human form, God in our image as opposed to us in God's image. Because we quite often see God as the man with the white beard sitting on the cloud that is kind to us if we do good things, and is vengeful to us if we don't do good things. And if we want good things, we bow down and worship, and therefore God will be gracious and give us good things. We don't see God that way. We recognize that God is all that is, and if God is all that is and I am, then God is all that I am. And so therefore I am the essence of God in human form. That's a little bit different, and some people would say, well, that's a little bit bold to say that because you're not really God. Well, I am God expressing in human form. And so therefore, I kind of am.
Just not all.
But a lot of spiritual traditions will also say that we cannot interact with God. Ooh, that's where this part really fits in. What is our interaction? What is our relationship to God, and how does God work in our lives? And because we know that God is the man on the cloud, separate from us, how can we interact with that, which is all it is. It has too many things going on to really pay attention to us individually. But we know that it does. And so therefore, how does that work? Well, we look at it a little bit differently. We know that as we recognize the divinity of who we are, because we are God in expression, and as we recognize ourselves as perfect beings expressing God into the world, we recognize that God is all that we are. And so therefore, there is no need to communicate with, because we already are it. Does that make sense? Kind of a big idea to wrap our minds around, isn't it? Well, I thought to basically understand how we got to this understanding, or this concept, or these principles, I would do a little bit of history lesson today. So we're going to go back in history and talk about the beginnings of the New Thought movement and how we got to where we are. I'm going to start with a man named Phineas Parkhurst Quimby. Now, it's fun to talk about him just because it's fun to say his name. Phineas Parkhurst Quimby. He was not a doctor when he started all this process. He was not a theologian. He wasn't even necessarily a positive thinker. To start with, he was a clockmaker. And he had a serious disease, or illness, known as consumption. Now, I know consumption because of my days back as being an opera singer, because that's what Mimi died of in La Boheme, and it's what Violetta died of in La Traviata. And so I knew that idea. It's pretty dreadful illness. Saps all your energy, makes it impossible to breathe. We know it today as tuberculosis. And so it's a pretty serious illness. He struggled with this for a long time. And finally somebody told him, there's a way to cure that. You get on a horse, and you ride a horse at extremely fast speed, and all that air will be forced into your lungs, and will clear out your lungs, and you'll be able to breathe. And it was a cure for tuberculosis. Well, he tried this. Problem was he was a little too weak. Couldn't really ride a horse. So he took his carriage out into the country, and he got that horse going as fast as it could, but pulling the carriage and him over those old country roads, the horse couldn't quite go as fast as he wanted to. He couldn't quite get the full effect. Finally, the horse was exhausted. He was absolutely exhausted, and whipping the horse to keep it going, and finally he just collapsed there in that carriage. And he had this thought, I am going to die here in this carriage because I have no energy left. I'm going to die here on this country road with this obstinate horse. And he said, I don't want this to be my end. He began to relax a little bit, change his thoughts, started thinking, I'm going to get home. One way or another, I'm going to get home. And little by little, he regained his energy, and he was indeed able to get home. And he had this amazing idea. If my thoughts could change my physical condition to the extent that I was actually able to get home today,
Or create life.
he had this enlightenment. And so he recognized the idea that maybe my thoughts had something to do with my actual physical being. He went on to find other ways to cure his tuberculosis, his consumption at the time. Takes us to another fascinating person who was well before his time. In fact, they probably never actually met because their birth and death dates overlap by 7 years, so we probably never met him. But Franz Anton Mesmer. Now, you may know that name Mesmer from the word mesmerizing. Well, Mesmer had this idea. He was a German doctor and practicing a little bit of astronomy. And he theorized the existence of natural energy transference occurring between animate and inanimate objects. He believed that he could actually affect people around him with his hands, kind of like Reiki nowadays, where you can actually feel whether it's touch healing or just the energy flowing between one person and another. And he also used magnets. This is back in the time, in the 1700s, when magnets were kind of new. And he coined the term animal magnetism. Sound familiar? Well, he started using magnets to move energy through blockages in people's physical ailments. And he got to the point where he really didn't feel like the magnets were really doing the trick. He felt that he had more control over the whole situation just using his hands and just using energy, moving energies around. So eventually he kind of gave up on the magnets. But once again, coming back to my opera background, in the opera Così fan tutte by Mozart, they actually used magnets to pull the poison out of people. So I knew that. I did not know that Mesmer and Mozart were friends. And they were buddies, and actually Mesmer had used also an instrument called an harmonica. And an harmonica is a musical instrument with crystal bowls in it. And you would get the crystal bowls spinning and touch the bowls, and it sounded like when you run your finger around a wine glass, that eerie kind of a sound. Well, he used that because he actually thought that it actually had an effect on people physically and in his treatments. That instrument was actually banned in several countries because some people in the audience seemed to have spiritual effects, and some people actually swooned during the performances, and actually some of the performers of the harmonica died. It was determined later on that it was probably a result of leaded glass in the machinery. So, but that's just a little rabbit hole we're going down here. But so he and Mozart were friends, and Mozart actually wrote some compositions for the glass harmonica. But after Mesmer's death, people still continued on with his basic ideas, and what they would do is put people in a mesmerized state through meditation, and then ask them questions about their ailment. And people would tell them what their problem was, and then they would either do the natural transference of energy, or they would be prescribed different medications for their ailments. Well, Quimby went to France, because that's where these people were practicing at the time, and studied with the people, and brought it back to the United States. And he had a friend of his who was like a physician, traveled around with him, and Mesmer would put people into a hypnotic state, a mesmerized state, and then ask questions, and the guy would recommend different remedies to heal them. Quimby noticed that not always were the same remedies recommended, and sometimes the same remedy was recommended for different ailments, and sometimes the same ailment would have different remedies. And so he decided maybe it's not actually the medication that is being prescribed, maybe it's the meditative state. So he tried doing this on his own, and he tried using his own meditation to put people in a memorized state and then heal them without any medication. Doggone if it didn't work. People's positive thoughts actually allowed them to heal themselves. So he went into business. Dr. Phineas Quimby now. One of his first patients was this lady known as Mary Baker Eddy. Mary Baker Eddy had been disformed since childhood, and it caused her a lot of pain. So she went to work with him, and through their processes together, Mary Baker Eddy felt that she was healed as a result of this process that he called the science of Christian healing. Because he actually studied, he was a very religious man, he studied the Bible and all the teachings of Jesus and realized that everything that was happening here was exactly what Jesus said. And so he applied all the teachings of Jesus to his work and came up with the terminology, science of Christian healing. Well, Mary Baker Eddy was healed by this teaching, by this therapy, and she was moved. She went back to Boston, and shortly thereafter slipped on the ice and broke her hip, and then healed herself using this process. She was so moved by it that she started the Church of Christian Science. She later then, as she was doing the Church of Christian Science, and Quimby was still doing his Science of Christian Healing, decided she didn't want the conflicting ideas working together. She actually sued Quimby for the rights to the name, and she lost. But she still held on to the Church of Christian Science, which is still, as you know, very vital today. She was kind of resentful by her loss and completely discarded anything that any responsibility for her healing attributed to Quimby, and claimed it was all herself. And when the New Thought movement eventually came about, she decided she didn't need to be a part of it. So Christian Science is no longer part of the New Thought movement. Now, she also had a practitioner in the Christian Science Church. Her name was Emma Curtis Hopkins. Emma Curtis Hopkins and she had a disagreement in terms of basic processes of things going on, and Emma Curtis Hopkins moved away and created her own school of metaphysics. And Emma Curtis Hopkins was a metaphysician, and she was also an alchemist. And she started a school, and she had some amazing students. George and Myrtle Fillmore, Nona and Anna Brooks of Unity, by the way. Charles and Myrtle were the founders of Unity. Nona and Anna Brooks were the founders of Divine Science, and this young upstart known as Ernest Holmes, which was the founder of religious science. Basically, that's where we come from. We come from a healing tradition. Now, we maybe have come away from the hands-on idea of it, but we do recognize that our thoughts, recognizing our inherent perfection, allow us to heal that which is not showing up as perfect in our lives. And so this idea of divine law, using divine law to actually create what we wish to experience in our lives, goes back to that teaching of healing. And that's where we came from.
So, in a nutshell, what he's saying is thoughts are creative. Our thought is creative. And so looking a little deeper at that soul part of how our thoughts are creative, I invite us to think about the saying mind over matter. Mind over matter. We've probably all used it from time to time, and it's a very powerful statement, mind over matter. And we use it in various ways. Mind over matter means learning to control your thoughts to achieve a desired effect. Learning to control your thoughts to achieve a desired effect. Now, most of us, day to day, have a desired effect we would like to experience, either right now in this moment, or for tomorrow, or next week, or throughout the rest of our life. And so, how do we do that? Well, we align our thought with laws that work. We align our thought with laws that work. Ernest Holmes has in this chapter, I'm not going to say it exactly the way he said it, but he says that if a misshapen being from the darkest lands of the earth planted pink roses in the soil would produce just as lovely a pink rose for him or her as the most beautiful picture star. Now, he uses picture star in his because at the time he was speaking to a lot of movie stars. He lived in California and spoke to thousands of people each week, and a lot of them were movie stars. But what he's saying is that the law works the same way for everyone. And so it's all about how we use it. The law always says yes to whatever we input into the law, and that's that middle part. So the top part of the circle is all that is, and really all of it is all that is. Life, energy, whatever you wish to call it, God is all that is. Love, my favorite word, is all that is. And in order to come into form, it must be chosen through a law that creates it. If you plant that rose seed in your garden, you do not expect to grow cucumbers. You expect a rose to appear. The law always says yes. So a very common question, and one that gets dealt with a lot in classes, the Science of Mind classes, is, well, if that's true, then why don't I always get everything I want? You do. And you can say you don't, and I can say, well, I wouldn't have chosen this, but somehow I did. So, I'm going to share 3 words that I know you're familiar with today as to what I believe we do until we learn to align our thought with law, with a law that will create according to what we desire. So one of them is zigzagging. I believe zigzagging means a course having abrupt alternate right and left turns. Now you might recognize that in your own thinking, but I would say that quite often we don't recognize it in ourselves, at least until we do, until we've had enough practice at thinking about how we think. So zigzagging looks like I make a decision, I go that way, suddenly I change my mind and I just go that way. Or I decide that isn't right either, so I suddenly go that way. Suddenly, I change my mind on a dime. And then I'm going to wonder after a time period why I didn't achieve what I thought I desired? No, it's because I kept changing my mind very abruptly. And the law goes with us every time. The law will always say yes. The next idea is waffling, failing to make up one's mind. So maybe we plant the seed originally, but we're unable to make a decision. So we say, well, I really want to heal this challenge that I have with the doctor. And so I'm going to know that this is healed and it's taken care of. And then I go out and I start telling everybody I know all about it. How many times am I going to say, oh, and I've got this terrible, terrible pain and it just won't go away? How many times am I going to say that before I realize that I'm creating it? I'm waffling. I'm not making a decision of which way I'm going to go, wholeness or dis-ease.
My favorite waffling quote is, what goes on in vagueness stays in vagueness.
I like it. And the third idea I want to bring to our attention is wavering. Wavering is when we're undecided between two courses of action. So I'm not sure if I should just go to the doctor or if I should do some things on my own. So I kind of go back and forth and I'm never really sure. And my mind is saying, yeah, I think this will work. Well, maybe not. Well, go the other way. And then we wonder, at the end of the day, why it hasn't worked. So here's what I think, why we don't always get what we want. We don't always know how to use our mind properly. And by that I mean, sometimes we really do know, but we don't use it properly because we haven't yet realized its incredible power. And by that I mean our incredible power. Yes, I said it. You are a powerful being. And I do believe that as a human race, we are way more powerful to affect good in the world than we have come to realize yet. And I believe that as we awaken and start looking at, okay, what mindset is it I need to align with to create exactly what I desire, we will do it. And that doesn't mean that we can do it for our loved ones. Would that we could, right? But it doesn't. We each have to do it for ourselves. Now, why does treatment work? Treatment works because, and treatment, if you're not familiar, is affirmative prayer, and it's 5 steps, and it works because you work it, and you work it until you know it, absolutely know it. The recipient, if you're treating for someone else, must be open to knowing it with you, knowing that you know it. So, and again, I'm going to share that same story because I know we have a few new people here today. I'll never forget when my girlfriend said, will you please treat with me for men? I need some men. And I started. And one day when I was treating for her, I went, oh my gosh, she has all kinds of men in her life. She doesn't want men. She wants a man. We are treating for exactly what she has. And so I shifted the treatment, and she is married today, happily married today. Treatment always works. So if it doesn't appear to be working, it's not because you did anything wrong. Please let me be clear with that. It is never because you did something wrong. It is simply because we have not aligned our thought with that which we truly desire to create and stuck with it. And so we will continue to work with that, won't we? Yes? We will
Yes.
continue to work with the law of life, creating exactly what we desire. And so it is.